Hi, this is Marsha.
And this is Kelly.
We are the 2U's of 2U's Fiber Adventures. Thanks for stopping by.
You'll hear about knitting, spinning, dyeing, crocheting, and just about anything else we can think of as a way to play with string.
We blog and post show notes at 2usfiberadventures.com.
And we invite you to join our 2U's Fiber Adventures group on Ravelry. I'm 100 Projects.
And I am Better in Motion.
We're both on Instagram and Ravelry, and we look forward to meeting you there.
Enjoy the episode. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Marsha.
The first time we've talked since I've been, well, that's not exactly true. That's the first time we've talked since I've been back from Scotland, but the first time we've recorded together since I've been home.
No, I know. It feels like forever. Because actually our last recording together was like mid-May. Mm-hmm. And then it went out late. But yeah, it was a mid-May recording. So I missed this.
Yes. I have too.
It wasn't quite the same. I did do a project update in one of your at the end of one of your dispatches, but it's not the same. Mm-hmm. Not the same for us, and not the same for all of you out there listening to us, I'm sure. Because Marsha did a project update. Well, yeah, Marsha did a project update in one of the dispatches too. So.
Yes, and honestly, I can't remember now what it was. I think maybe I finished my socks on the trip, I think.
Yeah, and then you the one I just published one today, which was the east coast of Scotland. Just went up today, and you talked a little bit about everything you finished while you were at your trip, because you were actually home.
Oh, okay.
By the time we recorded that.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it's been a long time since we've done this usual recording thing.
Well, I say in our usual format. However, our usual format's going to be a little different this time.
Yeah,
right?
Actually, yes, that's true.
So we're not even really back to normal yet. So we had put it out some time ago. We put a thread in the group of people had questions they wanted to ask of us, and so we decided in this
show.
Yeah. So we were going to talk a little bit about that. So we're not going to really do our normal project update. We'll do that maybe next episode. Yeah. But before we get on to, before we talk about answering questions or topics of discussion, we want to talk about one of our listeners, our Patreon.
Oh, yeah.
person. Yes. So let's talk about that.
Okay. So yeah,
a little housekeeping.
One of the episodes, the dispatch episodes, I pulled the winner for the second quarter in Patreon, and Barbara Grist is one of the winners, and she has not yet contacted me, so I wanted to make sure that she had heard her name, and I will contact her if I don't hear from her soon. But it's always fun to hear your name on the podcast, to hear that you won while you're listening, while you're out walking the dog or doing your exercises, or, as Louise always says, cleaning your toilets. Louise from Caithness Craft Collective. So anyway, it's always fun to hear. I think it's fun to hear that you won. So I wanted to just make that announcement that Barbara Grist, one of our patrons, has won the Patreon giveaway for the second quarter. So. And has not yet contacted me, so that would be 100 projects that you would want to contact Barbara. And you can contact me through Patreon, or you can contact me on Ravelry, or you can email us 2usfiberadventures.com and let me know your information so that I can tell you what you want and get it sent to you.
Yes, good. Now let's, should we talk about our topics that were suggested?
Yeah. So I put them into 3 categories. One of the categories is finishing. The other category, so that would be like all the things you have to do at the end: seaming, blocking, weaving in ends. Another category was stash, storage, and stash busting, which I have been doing a little bit of. And then 2 topics that we are not going to have time to get to today, but we will save for the next episode, is one is on spinning, and then the other one is about Ravelry and the use of Ravelry. So there were a couple of questions about Ravelry stuff, so we want to answer those too, but not today. So we're going to focus on the finishing and on the stash busting questions today.
Yeah. Okay. So, Kelly, do you why don't you read the questions?
Okay. So there were 3 of them. Connie LA said she would love to have a show on how to finish sweaters, wet finishing, pinning, and drawing. And then Later Knitter, who's Kristen, she also said she'd want to hear something about finishing, and that would include weaving in ends and even seaming. She says, and this is true, it's frustrating if the joy of finishing is squashed by seeing ends of yarn pull out in funny ways. And then Data Knitter, Pat, she said, I'd love a discussion about how best to weave in and secure ends of superwash yarn, particularly in multiple color lace pieces. I'm always worried that my ends will get loose and show or unravel. So those are all sort of finishing questions that I thought we could talk about.
Okay, and so I'm just going to throw in here before we even begin the discussion. I have 2 quick stories.
Oh, yeah.
So do you remember when, and I never know how to pronounce his name, but is it Kaffe Fassett or Kaffe Fassett or whatever, but in the 80s and 90s when his colorwork books were so popular, like everybody was buying those books.
Right, and there were even like ready-to-wear sweaters that were very similar to his designs, right?
Yeah. And it was his use of color that was so amazing. And like he would have a lot of colors, 20 or more colors in a sweater. And I remember I have several of his books, and I remember reading in there that he didn't even bother weaving in the ends. He just had everything was just knotted on the inside of the sweater because no one was looking inside the sweater. So you could, in terms of finishing and weaving in ends, you could just take that tack, which is don't do anything.
Right.
But that's not answering the question. And then the second thing
I want... And if you do that, just be sure you don't... Well, it wouldn't work like on a cardigan, for example. But if you do that, just be sure you don't have to rip off your sweater from a hot flash, rip off your pullover, with your T-shirt underneath of a hot flash, and then everyone sees your shameful ends.
They're not shameful ends. You could just say it's a design feature.
I guess that's true.
Okay.
Other knitters might think they were shameful ends.
But that is, again, as I say, that is not the topic of this show, of ignoring the ends. So, but the other thing I just wanted to say too, I was surprised at this, is when the trip to Scotland, we were on the Orkney Islands, and we went to a craft shop. I talked about this in the one of my dispatches, but this really nice craft shop in St. Margaret Hope, and I bought a Fair Isle hat there. As I was laughing, for educational purposes, because I've never made one and I need to know how to make one. But what I was saying, is that the ends were not woven in at all, and the woman who was running the shop is actually the one who made the hat. And I asked her about it, and she said, no, this is what she said. I'm just quoting her, so don't don't get mad at the messenger. She said you typically don't weave in the ends; you just tie a knot, and then when you wash, because Shetland wool is kind of sticky, in the sense that it's hard to unravel. So it just knotting it is enough to keep it in place, and then when you wash it and block it, that does enough to sort of full it, I guess, that those knots will stay in place.
And then when you wear it, that'll felt it a little bit more. The heat of your head. Yeah.
Now, so that was just an interesting thing, and I just wanted to throw that out there because this is the topic of weaving ends. Weaving in ends is the other option, is don't weave in the ends. Just I don't think that would work for superwash or cotton or linen. I mean, that's another whole issue.
I do think there's an element of shame about ends. I mean, that's a little strong of a word.
Yes.
But, a little bit of guilt, let's say. About ends if you don't weave them in, even if someone can't see them, because I'm doing a bear right now while we talk and working on one of the mother bears. And I remember seeing a post somewhere of somebody talking about the best way to weave in their ends on these bears. And the bears are stuffed. I mean, I was so perplexed by that because You don't have to weave anything in. They're stuffed. You just poke the ends in. Either you make sure they're all on the inside when you knit or crochet them, and if they're not, you just poke them all inside. I have no guilt about doing that. But there was a little discussion in one place where I was reading about mother bears about weaving in the ends. And if there's ever a place where you could just tie your two yarns together, you don't even really have to tie them together. You just pull them tight, and when you stuff it, it stays. But if you felt like you really needed to make sure nothing would come apart, just honestly tie a knot and make sure the ends are on the inside. No one will ever see them.
Yeah, yeah.
So I do think there is some amount of end shaming in the knitting and crochet world. So anyway.
Okay, but if we are going to weave in the ends and finish our sweaters, let's talk about that.
Okay.
So should we talk about weaving in ends first?
Sure. We're already there, so we might as well, yeah.
Okay. So I'll just say what I do. I'll tell you what I used to do is I would just make these sort of, I would weave in, I would just randomly weave it into the sweater. So I had like all these crisscross patterning, which really wasn't very noticeable on the outside, but it didn't look very good on the inside. And then I learned that the way to do it is that you actually just, on the reverse side, you do sort of like what they would call a duplicate stitch. I guess you're basically following the line of the stitches. And I'm sure probably most people know that. I will say sometimes if it's very fine, say fine yarn or something that is knitted at a gauge where it's very loose and drapey and kind of open, and that you like scarves sometimes can be kind of open and drapey, and if you hold them up to the light you can sort of see through them. Then sometimes I take the end of the yarn that I'm going to weave in, I take it and actually unply it. So if it's like a 2-ply or 3-ply, I unply it and I weave in either those 2 singles or 3 singles individually and do that duplicate stitch, and it sort of doesn't make a lump as much.
Yeah, it's a lot thinner,
More sort of, the open gauge, I think sometimes you can see it a little bit.
And then so you would take each one of those strands and you would duplicate stitch along a different group of stitches.
Yeah.
Because that means
and try to separate them. So don't put them all on, obviously not on the same row, but then also not on like the 3 rows right together, stacked on top of each other. I'd maybe make one go to the left and maybe one go to the right, and then go back and maybe make one 3 rows above the one on the left or something. I would do that to sort of spread out that thickness.
I do that too. That has worked pretty well for me on some things that I've done that have been a fine linen, like a fingering weight linen at a loose gauge, where like how do you weave in those ends without having them be seen? And they're also kind of wiry, so splitting them makes them less wiry. And then also the duplicate stitch makes them pretty much not even noticeable.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think there's anything wrong with doing what you used to do, Marsha, where you're like going under the bumps, for example, kind of in a diagonal, and then turn around and go back the other way and go under the pearl bumps, going the other direction. Yeah. So you have like I would say like a V shape. So I would go like up in a diagonal from where my end comes out, and then turn around and go down in a diagonal like an upside down V, or vice versa. Okay, well, and I say what I did is I would just go up and cut it off. I didn't make a line down. And it was just sort of, I think that the duplicate stitch we're talking about on the back of the work actually secures it more than just going up a straight line or a diagonal line up the, I think that it's that way didn't secure it as much. Having said that, it didn't come out. Right. With washing and blocking and years of use, it hasn't come out. Yeah, I think it's a little bit, it's very nice and tidy on the backside. And if you really want that to be the case, like if it's a cardigan and the backside's going to be seen, or if it's a shawl and you know the backside's going to be seen. But if you're doing something where the backside is really not going to be seen much, I think to me duplicate stitching is I mean, sometimes I just do it because I don't mind it. I don't think it's that onerous. I think it's kind of fun, the puzzle of following the stitches. But at the same time, if I'm not in the mood for doing that, I would have no problem with just going up in a V and then down in a V. One thing I would say, if you're going to do that, and this applies to slippery yarns, especially like superwash. Most of the tapestry needles that I have for weaving in ends had always been blunt. And then I bought a package of them that they actually weren't the knitting ones. They were needles I got in the sewing department, but they were big. And I thought, I was doing something else at the craft store and saw these needles, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to get these because you know how your tapestry needles for knitting, for weaving in ends always end up, at least mine, like, okay, where did they go? They all end up in like the same project bag that you can't find, where you would rather have them, you know, like one in one little tool pouch and one in a project bag. And anyway, I thought, I'm going to just get some more. Those have been great because I split the yarn. So I purposefully stick the needle through the yarn. If I'm not going to do the duplicate stitching thing, I purposely, and even if I am duplicate stitching, I don't worry. If I use this pointy needles, I don't worry about splitting the yarn. I purposely split the yarn because it does secure it in better.
Oh,
because
that
they're
makes
like
sense.
buried inside of other fibers. And so that, I think, Pat had asked about the superwash, and I'd say that's one of the techniques that I use a lot with superwashes. Use a pointy needle and split the plies.
I sort of try it like with wool. I try to, now it doesn't work with superwash necessarily, but I try to avoid the whole issue of having to weave in ends or a lot of ends by just doing the spit splicing when I'm knitting. That's not possible. I mean, with superwash, because it doesn't really felt.
No, but there are two ways I'm going to talk about that you can do something that results in no weaving with superwash.
Okay.
With something that doesn't felt, yeah.
Yeah, and then with like linen doesn't felt. Now I know when we were at the Knockers retreat, Elizabeth Doherty talked about the idea is you just take you sew that, like with linen, you just sew the two ends together and then knit with it. That's an option. It's kind of fiddly. I will say with like linen, when I'm knitting the garment and I know I'm getting close to the end of that skein or that ball that I'm working with, I try to put that change to the new ball under the arm. That's true even with wool. Now, usually if it's something that I can't spit splice, then I try to put any kind of change under the arm so it's less noticeable. Now, and sometimes you have like a long piece of yarn left over, and or sometimes it's happened too where I'm not paying attention and it ends up being right in the middle. But I'm less concerned if it's in the middle of the back. I just don't want to have that change in the middle of the front is what I'm most trying to avoid.
Yeah, I've had that before because I was trying to not have wasted yarn and I wasn't really thinking. And then I had my join in a kind of a prominent place. And then I ended up being able to weave things in where it wasn't really showing. But I had to be a lot more careful.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say with things like linen that are kind of slippery, I don't cut, when I cut, after I've woven in the end, I don't cut it close to the fabric. I leave a 1/4 inch or more to allow for some movement. I don't really want it to move out, but as you start wearing the garment and the fabric starts moving and stretching, that it gives it some space to kind of pull up that yarn into the knitted fabric. Does that make sense?
Yes,
what I'm saying?
and if it does pull in, it doesn't pull out to the other side.
Exactly.
And I've done that with cotton, with things with cotton yarn and linen yarn too. Sometimes you can't because it's right on the edge of your sleeve. Or I have a couple of tanks where you have to join for join at the underarm, and so that's not going to work because you can't guarantee that's going to stay on the inside. You'll be
Yeah.
wandering around in a tank top with a string hanging out of your armpit. But but it is, I do think, I mean, that's a really good instance where leaving an end is important. Because otherwise you are going to have, wherever you cut it, it's eventually going to shift and pop out the other side, which you might want to cut it on the front side. If
and then
you
pull
are
it around
gonna,
to the back?
Yeah, no, not pull it. I mean, just cut it flush on the front, and then once you wash and block it, it will pull into the back.
Oh, okay.
That's only just a thought that came into my head. That's not a tested strategy, but but yeah.
And the other thing I'm going to put into this category too about weaving in ends, and it's not technically about weaving in the ends, but when I finish a sweater and I weave in all the ends, and case in point, the sweater I made for my brother, the Jared Flood sweater, cobblestone. I didn't weave in the ends for the collar, or the sleeves, specifically the sleeves. This is the bigger issue, I think, sleeves, is because even though you measure the unwashed and blocked garment, you measure it on the person and you think they're going to be fine. When you wash and block it, there can be variation.
Yeah.
So I don't weave in that end until I'm sure the sleeve length is correct. And what I discovered with my brother is it did grow, the sleeves grew, and they were too long. So I had to rip them back about 2 inches.
And what a pain that would have been if you had duplicate stitch woven in those ends.
It'd be so hard to find that end.
Yeah. It's another.
So,
I mean, that's another argument for why the duplicate stitch weaving in of ends might not be the best choice. It depends on what you're doing, right? But if you ever think you might have to undo that garment,
yeah. But I think, it's for, like I'm not planning on ever undoing that sweater.
Right.
So I wove in the ends then.
Right.
Same thing, and we'll talk about this and we get to blocking. I just finished a linen t-shirt, and I did not weave in the bottom thread where I finished because it's a top-down t-shirt. I didn't, because I wasn't 100% sure about the length. And then it just gives you that freedom of after you washed and blocked it and you find that it's perfect, go ahead and weave in the end. It's not that big a deal. It's not going to make any difference. But it does make it harder if you decide that I do want it longer or I want it shorter. It just makes it easier to correct that if you haven't woven in the end. And the same thing with this t-shirt. I was unsure about the neckline, and I am going to have, the neckline is too large. And so I'm going to have to rip that out and pick up, I think what I'm going to do is pick up fewer stitches and go down you went just down 1 needle size for the neckline. I think I'm going to go down 2 needle sizes for the neckline and bind off a little tighter than I did. So I think those 3 things, fewer stitches picked up, another size smaller needles, and bind off more tightly, hopefully will draw in that neckline a bit.
don't make it so tight you can't get your head through.
Exactly. I don't think I'm in danger of that.
Oh, okay.
It's so wide, and I don't even know. It's sort of, if I move around a lot, it sort of is falling off my shoulders, and I have the flash dance look.
Okay.
So I don't think I'm in danger of that. But yeah, you're right. But that's the thing is I'm not going to, now that's linen, so it's a little bit slippier. It might be easier to find the end, but it's just easier just not to weave in the ends to begin with until you try, wash, block it, and try it on. So,
well, and I while we're talking about when you weave the ends in, I have heard so many people say they weave in the ends, but they don't snip cut them all the way off.
Oh, okay.
And then they wash and block it, and then they cut them off after it's washed and blocked.
Oh, now that kind of makes sense because then it has all the stitches, settle down into the fabric and everything. It makes sense that those woven in ends will settle in too.
Right, except I don't agree. I mean,
oh, okay.
Clearly it works for people, so I'm not saying it doesn't work. Yeah. But what I do, my feeling is, even with superwash, there's a little bit of grippiness of the fiber, especially over time. Something about that superwash process is not permanent. It doesn't seem quite permanent. And so when I weave in the ends, and I like to cut them off before it's washed, so that unless it's something you think you're going to have to undo, but before it's washed, if you cut those ends off, then the washing will sort of lock them in place a little bit better. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I make sure of, kind of like a little bit of felting, right? And the other thing I make sure of is I never snip them cleanly. So I don't have just a clean, like, surgical end of my yarn. Mm-hmm. I will either break the yarn and then weave in to the end of the break. So there's a rough, it's rough at the end. It's like tapered or, not cleanly cut. Or if I'm going to snip it off and not just weave in the whole thing, I use, you could do this with scissors too, but I have a blade. Mm-hmm. They were giving it away one time at one of the conferences I went to, so that, instead of having scissors on an airplane, it's like a blade inside of a plastic thing. Okay. So it's not open to any, anyway, so what I do is I just slide that blade along the yarn and kind of pull. So it kind of tears it and cuts it fiber by fiber instead of cutting it like cleanly across the yarn. That way there's a lot of loose, grippy fibers that can snuggle in with their neighbors when you wash it. And
I like that. Snuggle in with their neighbors.
Because if they're all just, if you cut it off really cleanly, it's one big clump, right? And they'll all stick together with that piece of yarn more. But if it's all kind of stretched out or, uneven, then they'll kind of spread out. And the other thing you can do is you can actually take your end of your yarn and fray it. If you need to, you can take the end of your yarn and fray it even more so that will happen. And that's what I do with my ends all the time. And I always think it seems weird to wash it first and then go through with the scissors and cleanly snip everything. Because the next thing that's going to happen is that cleanly snipped thing is going to pop through to the front side.
Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing, I wonder if you could use a seam ripper to kind of cut that yarn too.
It's the same idea as the blade that I have. You can actually do it with the scissors if you just kind of close the scissors, not all the way, so the yarn is in that sort of crotch of the scissors, and then just pull the yarn across it and it'll tear.
You could just chew them off too, I guess.
You could. Oh, that's a good idea. No one will ever take that method of cutting away from you at the TSA checkpoint. Ma'am, may I have your teeth?
On this topic also, I just wanted to say I did look online to see about videos about weaving in ends. Kelly, do you remember when I at the Stitches West, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I got kind of tired and I went out just to sit in the lobby and knit and have some water or coffee or something. And I ended up sitting next to a woman. Her name is Suzanne Bryan. And she is a master knitter.
Oh, yeah, I remember her.
And we got to talking, and she actually has a YouTube channel where she has all different types of tutorials. And she's very, very meticulous and very much a technical knitter. And so I put a link in our show notes. There'll be a link to her channel. And I also will put in there links to specific tutorials she has on weaving in ends for both garter stitch and stockinette. And I put those two because that's typically what we're doing, right? The two basic things. She also, Pat, Data Knitter, had also asked about weaving in ends for lace. And she has a tutorial on, which I'll put the link in the show notes too, about weaving in ends with lace. Because, when you're getting into lace, then it's not just straight stockinette or garter stitch. It's a tangled web of knots that you're having to weave in. So, but you basically the same thing. It's still basically a duplicate stitch in the sense that you just follow
the stitches that are there.
The path of the stitch. So you do the same thing, but it's a little more complicated because it's not so organized.
Right. It's harder to find those stitches,
Harder to find those stitches, but it's the same concept. And in that same one, she also talks about binding off loosely, like and this one she's doing a lace doily, but just another thing that she talks about. So there'll be a link to her her YouTube channel, which is very good. And then when we get into our next topic, she also has some great videos about blocking, washing and blocking. So which I have links for those too in there. But
nice.
So, but before we go too far, I wanted to ask you, you made a reference to another way of joining yarn besides spit splicing.
Oh, yeah. So there's two.
Okay.
And one of them is, it's from weaving, and it's called the weft clasp join. Mm-hmm. And what you basically do is you make a loop with the working yarn, and then you make a loop through that loop with the yarn you want to add in. Mm-hmm. So you have two strands on either side, right? So on one side of your work, you have the working yarn going up, turning around, coming back. And then on the other side, you have the new yarn coming up, going through that loop and going back. And so on either side, you have two strands, and they're locked together in the middle. They're clasped in the middle. Mm-hmm. And so in weaving, you use that if you want to change. You can use that to change colors in the weft. That's one of the ways to do it. Weft clasp, it's called. You can also do this for knitting. So you clasp the two yarns together, and you knit a few stitches, like 4 stitches, 3 stitches, something like that, with the doubled working yarn, and then you get to that join, you keep knitting, and now you're working 3 or 4 stitches with the new yarn that was attached, and then you drop the end and you keep going. So you do have some ends, but you can just cut them off.
Okay.
And if you...
So it's sort of like you're just weaving them in as you go along.
Exactly.
Right?
It's basically...
It's already following the pattern of the stitch.
Yes, the only difference... so another thing that I do a lot, instead of duplicate stitch after the fact, is basically what's effectively duplicate stitch before the fact, where I just hold the two yarns together, the old one and the new one, for a couple of stitches. Or not a couple of, like 4 to 5 stitches. I'll hold the two yarns together, just lay them together and use them as one piece of yarn. The problem with that is that you have, if you need a clean color change, you don't have it, because you have those 4 or 5 stitches in the middle are both yarns. It's fine if it's a single color. It's fine if it's a gradient, or you're blending yarns or whatever. But if you need a strict color change, that can be a problem, because you won't have it. But if you do the weft, I keep wanting to say weft clasp join, you have a clean, one stitch is the doubled yarn of one color, and the very next stitch after the join is the doubled yarn of the next color.
That makes sense. So that would be good, because also Pat, Data Knitter, also asked about weaving with if you're changing colors of yarn.
Right, in a shawl.
So that would be a really good technique to use then.
Yeah.
When you're changing colors.
It's a little fiddly to make sure that where the two yarns clasp is right at the place where you need the color to change. But it's not hard. It's just you have to make sure when you get there, you get your yarns adjusted so that you pull them in such a way that you have that join now happening right between, right in the right place, either at the end of the row or at the next stitch. So that's one, and then another one. Well, and the thing about this too is a little more secure than just laying the two yarns together and knitting with both yarns, because they've changed direction. Right, where they have that clasp, they've changed direction. So it's really unlikely that the end is going to work itself out of the stitches and then work itself out of that clasp. So that's one way. And then there's another way that I saw that I have not tried, but I want to try it because it looked really interesting. and I have a video. I'll have a video for it in the show notes. It's called the Russian Join, and Very Pink Knit, Stacey Perry, has a great video tutorial on how to do this. It's a lot like the clasp weft join, except you use a needle, a pointy needle, to take those ends. So instead of just having 2 yarns and you're knitting with 2 yarns, you take the one yarn that you've looped through. It's kind of hard to describe it. But when you loop the yarn through the other loop and you have that clasp, you have these ends hanging out. Well, you take the end and you actually embed it back into the yarn. So you take a needle and go through the center of the yarn and pull that tail back through the center of the...
Feed it into the body
itself,
of the core. Yeah, feed it back into itself.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a little bit thicker, but it's really not noticeably... I mean, it's not... It doesn't seem to be that much thicker than the original strand of yarn. I mean, obviously it must be. But it's not as thick as if you just lay the 2 strands together and do the clasp weft join. So I thought that was really interesting. I haven't tried it. Again, I think that would be really tricky to get that one would be really tricky to get the color change right exactly at the right spot.
Yeah.
But worth it, I think, if you needed an abrupt color change and you really didn't want it to look like there were 2 strands. So I haven't used it. I haven't had really occasion or cause to use it, but I think it would be really good. And then I actually have another tip for shawls that are stripes, and I think I've mentioned this before. If I'm making a shawl that's striped, so I'll, you know how they say you carry the yarn up the side? Instead of carrying the yarn up the side, I just do the first stitch of every right side row where the yarn would be carried. I do the first stitch of every right side row with both yarns doubled. And then I pick the one I need to go across the row. And that, I think, works really well too, because going up the side, you sometimes get it too tight.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is the video that Suzanne Bryan does. After she does the duplicate stitch on the back for about 3 stitches. That makes me nervous. I do about 10 to 12, just because in case it does come undone, it has a long way to travel before it gets to the. And the other thing, I don't know if this is right or not, but what I do when I'm the 2 pieces of yarn that I'm with the ends that I'm going to weave in, I tie a knot in them. And so what I do when I'm knitting, I tie a knot in them loosely when I'm knitting. And then when I'm done with the garment and I come back and I'm going to weave those in, I actually untie that loose knot and retie it to adjust the tension so those stitches match the other stitches. And tie a knot in. And I don't know if people tie knots typically or not, but I do tie a knot in it.
A lot of times I'll tie a half a knot. I won't make the full square knot, but just the first part of it. But and then depending on how it looks when I get to weaving in the ends, I might undo it when I weave in the ends, or if it looks okay, if it looks like the tension's right, I'll just leave it. Yeah. But I don't typically tie a full knot.
Okay. But I don't know if you didn't tie even a half knot and you only did wove in your ends 3 stitches, I would be really worried that if that did come undone, you would end up with a hole that would be very difficult, especially if it's a slick yarn. It'd be very difficult to put that all back into its proper order of stitches.
I think I would do 4 or 5. At the minimum, I would do 4 or 5 stitches. Well, and I'm thinking of it not as duplicate stitch, but as holding the 2 yarns together and knitting with them, because really that's the same thing as duplicate stitch. It ends up looking exactly the same. Maybe it's not exactly the same physically, although I think it is. But if I'm doing, holding the yarns together and I'm not going to do any further weaving in at the end, I would definitely do I would definitely do 4 or more stitches. And like a lace shawl, if you're, you really have a hard time doing duplicate stitch, you have a hard time hiding those ends, I would definitely consider holding my 2 yarns together and doing a few stitches, 4 or more stitches depending, or doing the clasp weft join, and then you can probably get away with fewer stitches because you have more turns,
I think that
more
clasp weft, I have to say it very carefully.
It needs a different name.
Joint is brilliant.
Yeah,
I think that's a brilliant idea.
I hadn't thought about using it for knitting. I knew about it for weaving, and I hadn't really thought about using it for knitting, but it solves some problems for sure. Connie also asked not just about the finishing, like the weaving and of ends, but of the wet finishing, pinning, and drying. So that blocking process. How do you do blocking, Marsha?
I always wash the sweater or the garment, whatever it is, I wash it. I will say the only exception I've made to that is when I made the garter squish afghan out of my dad's old sweater, which we can talk about that in stash busting. But because it fits a queen size bed, and I honestly didn't know how I could wash it. So I didn't, but I had pre-washed all of the yarn.
Oh yeah, you washed yarn for days.
I washed yarn for days. So I pre-washed everything. So so that's the only exception I've made, but I did pre-wash it. So otherwise, everything I wash afterwards. And I read, I was doing research online, and there's videos about now I've forgotten now what they call it, but it's, there's spray rock blocking or steam blocking, which is basically you take your dry garment, lay it out maybe lightly pin it, and then you spray it with water and put a towel on it and let it dry that way. Or you steam it with a steam iron. You don't let the iron touch the fabric, but just let that steam. Or if you have a steamer, and if you have difficulty, if you're worried about touching the garment with the hot iron, then you put a towel and lightly just steam it. So you're not actually touching the fabric at all. I don't do that because I like to actually wash it because a lot of my project I've carried all around the place. And then also many of the yarns, the spinning process, they put oil in them. This is what I learned when we went to New Lanark, is they actually put, they spray a petroleum product on the yarn, so it's easier for it to get to spin. And I want to get that out. Right. And also, I think washing it makes it as what did you say? Like all of the neighbors, it's all settled in. The neighbors. All the neighbors snuggle in together, and I think the fabric looks a lot better. And also, many of the yarns look better after they've been washed. They sort of bloom. Yeah. For sure, linen has to be washed because it's I don't want to say harsh, but it's kind of a stiff. Right. And I've never seen the processing of linen, so I don't know what they put on the linen to get it, for the spinning process. But when you work with it, it's very stiff and kind of hard, and it definitely has to be washed.
Yeah, and it might. Depending on how stiff it is, it might have to be washed and dried and ironed, and washed and dried and ironed, or maybe frozen and ironed. There are lots of things you can do with 100% linen yarn that you would never dream of doing to wool or cotton or silk, but that linen really appreciates.
Yeah.
I always wash things, and I think one of the reasons that got me started washing was that I was a hand spinner. So, and in the days when I started spinning, you didn't go buy, commercially prepared braids at a fiber show. You bought wool that was not very heavily processed, or maybe you were processing it yourself. And so a lot of times, I'm not talking about spinning in the grease, but it's just one more time to help get out the gook. Yeah. Right. And I say that in the most loving way because I love the gook in fleece. Yeah. But it's just one more chance to get out the dirt, the lanolin, all of that. And then the other thing, that taught me to wash things was that I, early on in my yarn adventures, took a weaving class at the college where I teach, and they had a lot of yarn that had been donated, and goodness knows how old that yarn was and how long it had been sitting. And even if it's sitting in a cupboard, there is a lot of dust. Mm-hmm. And so, and really, when you buy a yarn from a yarn shop, you don't know how long it's been sitting in there.
Mm-hmm. Or sitting at the manufacturer and all the other.
Yeah. And so, people talk about, the dirt of traipsing the project around. I think probably sometimes the dirt of sitting in the shop being pawed over by rabid knitters mm-hmm. or just sitting and gathering dust, is worth washing. And then that helped me discover all those other reasons that washing was the right thing to do. But it was kind of a necessity in some of the projects that I did in my weaving class. Mm-hmm. And there were people who were afraid to wash their weaving. And I thought, oh, how could you stand to have that thing that you don't... I mean, I'm not a germaphobe or anything, but something that's been in a cabinet or in somebody's stash and then in a cabinet for... Yeah. Like, some of that was... clearly from the 70s.
Well, so the Afghan I made for my father, the main color was his old sweater, which was very old and had moth damage. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted to wash that because I was afraid that there might be something still in there. And then all the contrasting colors were things that I had, or that a lot of them, and the bulk of them, I got them from the Goodwill. Who knows where that's been?
Yet another reason to wash it. Yeah, so washing is a great thing. And then what do you do to block?
My last thing, before we go into blocking, the last thing I'm going to say about washing, though, is about the oil that they put on the fiber to spin it. Do you remember I bought a cone of yarn. Honestly, I don't remember if I bought it at the Goodwill or if I got it from a Steve. I think I got it at the Goodwill, and I made a sweater out of that. And I washed it. I was shocked at how black, and it was a teal colored sweater, but the water was black. Mm-hmm. It came off, it was so dark, and the sweater actually lightened up because it was just so dark with dirt. But I think also because the dirt can't get all the way it's so tightly wound on the cone, the dirt actually can't get to the center of the cone in theory. Mm-hmm. But the petroleum smell that came off of that sweater, and I think it probably was yarn meant for weaving, probably, and Kelly is... You know more about weaving than I do. Is weaving yarn more heavily oiled or on it because
it helps it helps for the yarn to be more stiff or less bouncy in weaving. Yeah.
So I had to wash that sweater 3 times, I think, before the petroleum smell went away. Wow. So and I don't know again if it's because it was prepared for. Well, who knows what? It didn't even have a label on it, so I don't even know what it was for. And I don't even really like the sweater because it's so itchy. I can't wear it. So who knows what that yarn was for? But so that's the last thing. Just really, I think it is important to wash. Just that's what I have to say. Okay, now the topic of blocking. So as I say, I do always wash. I have never been so I soak it in water. Just tepid water, not hot water or even ice cold water. And the reason I don't do ice cold is I think that the soap works better in a little bit warmer. I don't think it works. This is probably just me. I don't think it works as well in icy cold water.
Well, if there's anything oily, it's better in warmer water.
Right.
And I like hot water.
See, and I don't use hot water.
Unless I'm afraid of the dye job. Unless I don't want the dye to bleed, or if it's wool, I use hot water. Mm-hmm. If I don't want the dye to bleed, then I'll use warmer water. But yeah, I'm almost always using hot water.
And then you just let it sit till the water gets cold or cool? Mm-mm. Oh, you just rinse it with more hot water? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what I do is I just I have a 5-gallon bucket. Well, depending on the size of the project. If it's a sweater, I have a 5-gallon bucket. If it's just a scarf or a shawl or some socks or something, I just put it in a bowl. I used to just put a little bit of Dawn in there. I now have that. What's that lavender scented sweater wash? It starts with an E.
Eucalan?
Eucalyptus, thank you very much. I use that. It says you don't have to rinse it. I always rinse it.
I don't use the stuff that you don't rinse, I don't know why. It just feels to me like I need it to be rinsed.
Yeah, I like to rinse it out.
I'm a rinser.
Well, I'm a rinser because it gets more dirt. It gets more stuff out, too, rinsing, you know?
And I think that's I rinse for that reason, and I rinse, and I use hot water for that reason. I mean, it all comes from my early spinning days of the more times you subject the yarn to water, hot water in particular, the better chance you have of getting the lanolin and the things that you don't want out of that yarn.
Let me ask a question, though, just for listeners. When you use, because when you use really hot water, use hot water to wash your sweaters, you're not agitating them in any way. Or do you agitate them a little bit?
A little. It depends. The first time I wash things, like if I'm washing it to block, I usually do it depends what it is. But if I want it to be nice and cozy and fuzzy a little bit of halo, like with the woolen spun yarn that I used for my Orca's Run sweater, or the woolen spun yarn that I used for my Funky Grandpa. With those where you want the yarn to bloom a little bit, and you know, I swish it around. I'm kind of aggressive in my washing.
You're not because you're not worried about, because you're not doing it unattended. I mean, you're there so you can watch to make sure you're not felting.
Right, and I think because I've washed so many skeins of yarn, because of spinning, and I've washed so many fleeces, and I've also done felting, I am less afraid of that any little movement is going to cause felting. Now, there is some fiber where that's the case. Right. So I'm not saying, just willy-nilly swish your sweaters around. If you're using a super fine, low micron merino, then you're going to have to be careful.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to be clear on that. No one goes, I'll just go swish it around in the hot water for an hour. And
I don't do it. I don't do it for a very long time. And I don't ever. You don't want to take it out of the hot water and put it in a cold water rinse. Right. Again, unless you're purposefully trying to full it.
Right. You can go from cold to hot, but you can't go from hot to cold.
Yeah, you can always make it hotter. So, by the time I'm done washing it, the water's cooled off a little bit, and then I'll use a hot rinse water that's hotter than the water that is in, and that's fine. Okay. But you don't want to put it into a cooler water than what it's in. Yeah. I think that's probably a good caveat, just to make sure people...
Yeah, I just want to be really clear about that. Yeah.
Just because I'm reckless doesn't mean everyone has to be.
So anyway, then what I do I lay it out. I roll it up in towels, and usually takes 2 or 3 towels. So I take after I've rinsed it, I take the sweater out, or the garment, whatever the object is, I take it out of the water, squeeze as much water out as I can by hand, and then I lay it in a towel, roll it up in a towel, and stand on it, which is funny. Today I spent time watching the Suzanne Bryan videos, and I was pleased to see that she stands on it too, because I thought maybe this was like, oh my God, no, you never stand on it. But that's what I did. I stand on
Marsha,
it.
There are so many fewer rules than people actually think.
But I figure I'm a good weight
Although one thing you don't want to do, especially if you have one of those really fine. I have to laugh at people who won't touch their thing they're washing while it's in the wash water for fear of felting, but then they roll it up in a towel and stomp on it. In the olden days, that's how they fold blankets.
Yes, and let me just say, it's not like I'm jumping on it. I just step on it and stand there.
And I do kind of step a few times, but there's a limit to how much you want to do that if you have something that's really feltable.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not jumping on it and moving around for a long time.
There's probably a limit to how effective it is, and so you wouldn't do it for... I mean, at a certain point, your towel is soaked through, so it doesn't matter. Probably no one is going to do that, but But I just think that's kind of funny because that is the technique that they used for fulling blankets and fabric.
So, but anyway, then I go and I take the item and I lay it out on a towel, a dry towel, and usually I have in the spare bedroom, I have a twin bed, and I usually just lay it out on that. Or if it's really big, too big for the bed, I lay it out on the floor. I have a Turkish carpet in the room, and
you don't have blocking mats.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. I have blocking mats.
Oh,
I would say save your money and don't buy them, because they're never the right size. I can't. There's not enough of them for a sweater, so your sweater ends up hanging off of them. The ones that I bought, and I don't even know what brand I bought, but they came in like an orange bag, and it was it came with the blocks and pins, I think. I never use them because I find the best thing is just a towel, and then I lay the towel, and I have a big, like those bath sheets, those really big towels that I got at the Goodwill that I just lay out, and that works for a sweater, usually works for a shawl, and then I lay it out, and I just basically I follow usually most patterns, like for a sweater has the schematic, so I just lay it out, and so I know how what I want. So I follow the schematic and measure it that way. Dimensions. And I pin it. If it's lace, I pin it sort of, I block it and pin it sort of aggressively. So I pull it sort of in this, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but it's what I do, is I put it a little bit bigger than what the pattern says, because I find that it does, especially with a shawl, with lace, you have to block it relatively aggressively to get the lace to show.
Right.
You have to spread it out, kind of. And so, I don't want to totally, because it is a little, I wouldn't say it's delicate, but you don't want to be so aggressive that you're pulling it that you might break a yarn or break a thread. But you want to stretch it out significantly. And so sometimes, like with lace shawls, I have the blocking wires that I use. And they're a big hassle because you have to thread them through the fabric. It's a big pain. But
I love them because you don't have to put pins in every little inch of the fabric.
Yeah, that's true. So I like the blocking wires because you don't have to put pins in every inch of the fabric. However, you have to spend that time feeding it through the fabric.
It's not really faster, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it's still
The other thing I'm just going to say too about pins is, and I don't even know if these exist, but you want to make sure you have stainless steel or something that's not going to rust, because that would, I don't even know if they make pins that would rust.
They used to.
That's just,
I mean, I know they used to because I have some snowflakes that my grandmother made, and they have rust spots where they were pinned out. Yeah, and that's not me repinning them out after she made them and I washed them and needed to reblock them. They were washed and blocked and pinned out originally and ended up with these spots. Now, I don't know if the spots showed up right away or if the spots appeared over time. I don't know. That I don't know. But yeah, you can definitely get rust spots from your blocking pins if you're not careful.
So I guess just check that. And then, so then today, this is interesting. I just looked at the Suzanne Bryan's tutorials about blocking, and so she shows just blocking a sweater made in the round. It's actually that what's the one Zweig that everybody's making? Zweig that everybody's making. That's the sweater. But what she does, and I thought this was interesting. I just dump the whole sweater into the bucket, I just put it in there, and I do the thing where you sort of push it down to get all the air out of it, and I just let it soak for 20 or 30 minutes. What she does, she actually folds the sweater up into a square and puts it into the water with nothing in it, no soap or anything. I want something in there I like a little extra soap, just a little of the Dawn or that other. But she doesn't use any soap. She just lets the sweater soak, pushes it down, gets the air out, lets it soak in this sort of folded square for 20 minutes. Then she lifts it out in the square, squeezes out as much water as she can, and then that square she puts into the towel to roll, fold over, and then she steps on it. And then she takes the sweater and she can then just unfold it. The reason she does that is, when you have if you just throw the sweater into a bucket willy-nilly and then you go to lift it out, how it's all, the sleeve pops out.
You have to be careful.
And then and you have to be careful because it's really heavy now that it has all that water and you can really stretch it. So I thought that was a really good technique to do that.
You need to make sure that it's all cradled. However you do it, that's a good way to do it. Although that wouldn't be enough washing for me.
That wouldn't be enough washing for me. The other thing is maybe I thought is when I watched this, I'm thinking that's not enough washing for me, is you could put it in like a mesh bag maybe to hold it all together. Yeah. That's one thought. I don't know. It's something to think about.
A lot of times I'll use my dryer, or my washer to spin it out. And that works, for me, that works pretty well. Like for a bigger thing, I'll usually put it in to spin. Because I have a spin cycle that I can just put it on spin and no water pours in. It's not rinsing and spinning at the same time. It's a top loader.
Yes, and I have a spin cycle where no water will go in. I could just put it on spin, but it goes for about 10 minutes. And I think, and it locks, so I can't stop it mid-spin. I just have it spin for a minute or two, or check it, and lock. I can't do that, so I don't put mine on the spin cycle. But the other thing that she does I thought was interesting is while the sweater is soaking, she takes her schematic and she measures out, and she uses the blocking squares. So I don't know if this would work on a towel or not, but anyway, she marks like where, where the armpit, so where the sleeve joins the body, she marks that point on the blocking squares, and she marks the other one in that distance apart. So say it's supposed to be, the circumference is supposed to be 40 inches. Then she makes those two pins 20 inches apart. She also then measures how long it's supposed to be, and she puts a pin in there. And then she also measures where, so say from the underarms to the top of the collar, it's supposed to be 9 inches. Then she measures that out.
That makes good sense, because one of the things that I find, even though I'm using a tape measure and I'm measuring, often the direction that I'm going, like I haven't laid it out ahead of time what that 20-inch or 40-inch measurement is. And so by the time I put one part in and then I stretch it or, put it out to the right measure, it's like awkwardly turned, and now it's not going to fit on the thing I was trying to block it on. Like I'll often have to go get another towel, because by the time I get it into the right dimension for the schematic, it's now a shape that's not the right size for the towels I laid down.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. What she does is the pin idea. Then the other thing I thought was interesting is she doesn't pin the sweater down after. She just takes her fingers and she sort of moves it till it's, the armpits are up against those two pins, the bottom is at those two pins, and lays it all out and doesn't do any pinning of it at all or stretching it. So I don't know how that would work. And she said,
I think it would depend on what kind of patterning you had. If it was just stockinette or, not something with lace, that would work well. But
it's interesting because that sweater, the Zweig, has both stockinette, or I don't know if there's patterning on the body, but I think like the body's basically stockinette and the yoke is lace. So it's interesting how, she just does it that way. And now she doesn't show the sweater on, she shows it dried, but she doesn't actually show it on how it fits. But I thought that was an interesting technique, that she's not doing any pinning, she just lets it lay there. But I did think that idea of folding the sweater
that's a good
is
one.
Interesting, because it is hard if you have a big sweater, and say you have a man's extra large sweater, it's hard to lift all of that out of the water and not have some part of it pop out, and sag and drag.
Yeah, well, and that's pretty much, I think we do similar things with blocking. I don't have blocking mats either. I use the bed, or we have an ottoman if it's small enough, or I'll do it on the carpet with several towels underneath. And then I'll just pin it right into the rug. Yeah.
Yeah, I pin it right into the rug. And I should say too, the other reason I do it in the spare bedroom is I can shut the door so the dog can't go in on it. I'm worried about him, like, oh my God, if he was to eat one of those needles or step on one or something. So, and I don't want him damaging in the sweater, so I can just shut the door.
Well, and we both live in places with some humidity. Like I was going to say about blocking lace, one of the reasons to block it aggressively is that we have enough moisture in the air that it goes back to what it was before, right? The blocking doesn't stick. It doesn't last forever. I find that the blocking doesn't last forever. And I think it's just because there's enough moisture in the air that the wool pulls in the moisture and then goes back to the way it wants to be. But we don't have so much moisture that putting a wet garment on a towel that will then absorb that moisture in a humid climate would not dry. I mean, I could imagine that would not be a good solution for somebody like where Robert and I went to visit 2 summers ago in Arkansas, and the humidity was like 90% or something. Like, I don't think you could dry a sweater that way.
Yeah.
So that's maybe different. I mean, maybe one of the things about blocking mats is that you don't have a damp towel underneath your knit. So that might not be a good solution for everyone, what we do, but it sounds like we pretty much do the same thing. So,
yeah.
Well, Marsha, I'm thinking that maybe we should, if we're finished with finishing, that maybe we should save the stash discussion for the next episode.
We don't want to bore people, right?
Right.
Wear your ears out listening to us. So do you want to talk about stash busting then next time?
Yeah, let's do that next time.
Okay.
And then we also have the spinning question, and we have the Ravelry question. So we'll save those topics for another episode. But this gets us through the 3 questions that were all about finishing, and there were lots of agrees on these questions. So I think there were other people who wanted to hear about this too. So.
Okay. All right.
So hopefully we gave you all some good information.
Yeah.
Marsha, you got some good stuff.
I spent a good bit of time just researching and looking at videos, and it's not like I don't think that I'm that Suzanne Bryan paid me to talk about her all the time. I'm not getting a commission or anything, but I think she does very good videos.
Well, and I remember in talking with her that she was very technical.
Very technical, yeah.
Those are good videos to have as a resource. Yeah. And then if you want to just go from there and do what works, but maybe isn't as quite as time consuming or fiddly, you can.
Or you can just throw that sweater in a bucket of water and go from there. Throw caution to the wind.
I never talked about seaming. I'll have to talk about seaming another time. Because I learned some things about seaming from my Assam sweater. I'll talk about them in my project updates in the next episode.
Well, and you also, and we've talked about this, but you learned about seaming with those Argyle socks too.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll talk about that.
So we have some things to say about seaming, I guess. But we should let people rest their ears. My grandmother used to say to me, I think you should go in and rest your throat. Oh my gosh.
Okay, so we'll talk about those other things in another episode. Okay. But before we say goodbye, I just want to talk about our planned meetup that we're going to have.
Oh yes, this is exciting.
Very exciting. So I don't even remember now how this came up. I think it came up about when we were at the Knockers retreat. Is a lot of people had talked about that I go down to Seabrook, Washington a lot. And so I contacted Jean Chambers, who owns String Theory Yarn and Fibers in Seabrook. We talked about the idea of having a meetup down there at the yarn shop. And it'd be time then also to go to the beach and do some fun things. So we picked a weekend. It's the weekend of September 20th through the 22nd. So what we're thinking, and we're still working out the details, but in general, thinking just gather on a Friday evening, have some wine, cheese at the shop, in the evening, and then have all day Saturday to hang out in the shop and knit. We're working on all of that. As I say, we're still trying to figure out the details. But if you want to stay at Seabrook, I'll post their website, a link to their website. It's just seabrookwa.com. So seabrookwa.com. And you can go on there and find houses to rent. The address is technically Pacific Beach, Washington. So if you just go on TripAdvisor, Travelocity, or any of those sites, you can find other accommodations in the area around Seabrook that are on the Washington coast. I think Ocean Shores has a lot of hotels and accommodations. They're about 30 minutes south. And then there's all sorts of accommodations along the coast. So
I'm going to break in here to say also, if you are local to the area, you'd be welcome to just join us for the day, either Friday evening or sometime during the day on Saturday. As Marsha says, we'll have more information about scheduling a little bit later in the summer. So if you're interested, save the dates. It's the weekend of September, starting Friday, September 20th, 21st, and 22nd.
So if you want to start holding that weekend, if you want to join us, that would be really fun. Kelly, you're planning at this point.
I think I will be there, yeah.
As I say, I'll have more details, but I just wanted to get it out now since it is July.
Right.
Just to hold that date.
What the time frame is, yeah.
With the time frame, hold that date, and if you want to go ahead and book something, we're going to make that happen. We'll give our throats a rest and people's ears a rest too. Okay.
All right.
Okay. All righty. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. To subscribe to the podcast, visit 2usfiberadventures.com.
Join us on our adventures on Ravelry and Instagram. I am Better in Motion, and Kelly is 100 Projects.
Until next time, we're the 2Us
doing our part for World Fleece.